In the world of survival horror, some games achieve legendary status, not just for their gameplay, but for the eerie stories surrounding them. These titles go beyond mere entertainment, seeping into the minds of players long after they've put down the controller. Whether through disturbing lore, unsettling atmosphere, or hidden secrets that blur the line between fiction and reality, these games create an experience that feels almost cursed, making them feel alive in ways that other mediums simply can't achieve. But then there's Rule of Rose, a game so rare, so controversial, it's become the stuff of gaming myths. Instead of being remembered as a horror classic, it faded into obscurity. Except today, Rule of Rose is one of the rarest and most expensive PS2 games in existence. But why? Here, chaps and lasses, can you do me a favour? Can you fix this for me by subscribing so I can eventually crack the bastarding algorithm? Cheers, enjoy the video. Before Rule of Rose even had a chance to prove itself, it was already being condemned in Europe, sparking widespread panic and moral outrage. Back in 2006, an Italian journalist from the publication Panorama wrote a preview of Rule of Rose, a month before its European release and 8 months after it was available in Japan. His article painted the game as something far darker than what it actually was, claiming it featured sadistic violence, child abuse, and psychological torture, all centered around a young girl being buried alive. The Panorama article quickly caught the attention of Italian politicians, including the then Minister of European Affairs, who publicly condemned Rule of Rose, urging European governments to take action against the game, claiming it contained obscene cruelty and that it should be banned before corrupting young minds, a topic that has already been covered on my channel during my bully video. But the media frenzy intensified as other politicians and journalists, many of whom never played the game, added their voices to the uproar, with the controversy escalating to France, where the Minister of Foreign Affairs echoed the same concerns. Over here in the United Kingdom, the hysteria led to so much severe backlash that the game's publisher, 505 Games, decided to cancel the UK release entirely, fearing public and governmental scrutiny. Meanwhile, Poland's Deputy Minister of Education took things even further, filing a report with law enforcement claiming the game promoted criminal behaviour. The case was eventually dismissed, but by then, the damage had already been done. The Rule of Rose controversy had reached an irreversible boiling point. But here's the problem. Despite all the claims, those who actually played Rule of Rose knew these accusations were greatly exaggerated. Whilst the game was undoubtedly dark and unsettling, it was a psychological horror title, telling a tragic and symbolic story about childhood trauma, bullying, and social hierarchy. There were no explicit torture scenes, no sexual content, and no actual child abuse. What made the situation even more frustrating was that much of the outrage stemmed from misleading interpretations. Many of the politicians and media outlets condemning Rule of Rose relied on second-hand descriptions instead of actually playing the games themselves. The original Panorama article had set off a chain reaction of misinformation, one that was never properly corrected. And are you ready for the plot twist? The very article that ignited the panic surrounding Rule of Rose wasn't just misleading, it was plagiarized. A teenage fan, Chris Darrell, had imported the game from Japan and posted an online review detailing its eerie atmosphere and psychological horror elements, 8 months before release. Instead of conducting proper research, the Panorama journalist just lifted large portions of Darrell's review almost verbatim, twisting its context and sensationalizing the game's content. This means that the entire European controversy, which led to government officials condemning the game and even its cancellation in the UK and the US, was built on an article that wasn't even original. A single act of plagiarism snowballed into an international moral panic, proving how misinformation, especially in the hands of mainstream media, can shape public perception and even impact the fate of a game, a story that us gamers know far too well. And because of all of that, Rule of Rose is now remarkably expensive, as it only made it to limited shelves within Europe. The controversy surrounding it not only led to its scarcity, but also cemented its reputation as one of the most infamous survival horror games of its time. But in the end, despite all of this shit, even if it had reached store shelves unscathed, it was up against a much bigger problem: timing. A year before Rule of Rose came out, the gaming landscape had shifted. By the time Rule of Rose finally made it to shelves, Resident Evil 4 had already redefined survival horror. Horror games weren't just about slow, atmospheric tension anymore, they had evolved into high-stakes action thrillers. And that's where Rule of Rose ran into its biggest problem. Even if it had never been controversial, it was doomed to be overshadowed. Resident Evil 4 didn't just release in 2005, it revolutionized the genre. This wasn't a slow, methodical horror game in the vein of Silent Hill or classic Resident Evil entries. Instead, it was a cinematic, action-packed reinvention that made horror feel fresh again. The over-the-shoulder camera movement gave players more control, making combat immersive in a way that older fixed camera games never could. Instead of cowardly wrestling with tank controls, you could aim, shoot, and react in real time. Enemies weren't just slow, shambling threats, they were fast, relentless, and intelligent. This shift completely changed player expectations. Suddenly, horror wasn't about atmosphere and slow tension. It was about intensity, pacing, and gameplay mechanics that felt fluid. Look, we were fine with this. I cannot stress how insane Resident Evil 4 was. Rule of Rose wasn't just slow-paced, it was frustratingly clunky. Even for a survival horror game, it was outdated before release. Movement was sluggish, combat was unresponsive, and encounters with enemies felt more like a chore than a challenge. But Resident Evil 4 made players feel empowered yet vulnerable, Rule of Rose made you feel helpless but not in a fun way. And in an era where people were used to smoother, more responsive gameplay, this was a huge problem. Players have already seen what horror games could be, and Rule of Rose just didn't measure up. But here's the thing, if players did want a horror game with a vulnerable female protagonist and a loyal canine companion, they already had one. Haunting Ground launched a year earlier in 2005 as well, and while it wasn't a massive hit, it didn't have the baggage that Rule of Rose carried. It had a clear narrative, tense stalker-based horror, and gameplay that, while still survival horror, felt smoother and more intuitive than Rule of Rose. Rule of Rose relies on cryptic storytelling, leaving players to piece together its themes and meaning, often resulting in confusion. Even when all the pieces are laid out, its heavy use of symbolism and abstract storytelling makes its narrative feel distant and difficult to grasp. In contrast, Haunting Ground presents a cohesive and unfolding narrative. Fiona Belli's struggle is immediate and personal. She wakes up in a castle with no memory of how she got there, and must escape while being hunted by deranged pursuers. The stakes are clear, and every encounter builds on her journey, making it more emotionally engaging, where Rule of Rose relies on interpretation and ambiguity. Haunting Ground provides a more digestible experience, one that still delivers psychological horror but with a stronger gameplay foundation. Instead of fumbling through frustrating combat, players must outsmart their pursuers using stealth, evasion, and their canine companion Huey to survive. And that's the key difference. While both games featured a vulnerable female protagonist and a dog companion, Haunting Ground made those mechanics feel more refined and engaging. Huey wasn't just a sidekick, he was a vital tool for survival, capable of attacking enemies, solving puzzles, and even influencing Fiona's emotional state. Ground in Rule of Rose was a great narrative addition but lacked the same level of interactivity, mainly serving as a tracking mechanic rather than an active partner. On top of that, Haunting Ground had the backing of Capcom, a publisher with an established track record of survival horror. Even though it had a limited release, it still benefited from better marketing and name recognition, whereas Rule of Rose struggled to even reach store shelves. So for players looking for a similar experience, one with a gothic horror atmosphere, psychological themes, and a loyal canine companion, Haunting Ground was the more accessible choice. And by the time Rule of Rose finally arrived, it wasn't just overshadowed, it was practically forgotten. So for players who are interested in this specific horror experience, Haunting Ground already filled that void. And for anyone else, we were busy playing Resident Evil 4. So that raises the question, if Rule of Rose had released without controversy, would we even be talking about it today? Honestly, probably not. Without the bans, misinformation, and outrage, Rule of Rose would have faded into obscurity. Just another forgotten survival horror game that came out at the wrong time. And ironically, the controversy that once buried Rule of Rose is the same force bringing it back to life. The myth, the rarity, and the legend of its controversy have made Rule of Rose more sought after than ever. Not because of its gameplay, not because of its story, but because of what it represents. A game buried by scandal, only to be resurrected by curiosity.